I still remember the moment everything stopped making sense, though at the time, I didn't realize it was the beginning of everything falling into place. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no betrayal caught in real time, no sudden revelation that shattered my world in a single second. Instead, it was quiet, almost invisible. The kind of moment most people would overlook without a second thought. It started with a number. A single transaction buried in a list of dozens, maybe hundreds, that I had no real reason to question. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't even curious. I was just there, sitting in front of a screen, doing something routine, something forgettable. And yet, for reasons I still can't fully explain, that one number caught my attention. It didn't look wrong. That was the problem. It looked too ordinary to matter. And yet something about it lingered. The name attached to it, Blue Harbor Solutions, meant nothing to me. But that didn't bother me either. Not at first. Businesses had vendors all the time. New names appeared. Old ones disappeared. It wasn't my world to question. Except, I had been part of his world long enough to recognize what didn't belong. I didn't know it yet. But that moment, so small, so insignificant, was the first crack in something much bigger than I had ever imagined. At the time, though, I told myself it was nothing. I closed the screen. I moved on. I went back to being who I had always been. Or at least, who I thought I was. My life wasn't extraordinary. Not in the way people imagine when they hear stories like this. There were no warning signs flashing in red. No obvious distance growing between us. No dramatic changes that would make someone stop and say, something is wrong. Patrick was consistent. That was the word everyone used when they described him. Reliable. Focused. Successful. He built his life, and ours, with a kind of quiet precision that made everything feel stable. Predictable. Safe. And I believed in that. I believed in him. We didn't have the kind of marriage people posted about online. There were no grand gestures. No constant displays of affection. No exaggerated declarations of love. But there was structure. There was routine. There was a sense that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. And for a long time, that was enough. I had my own work, my own responsibilities, my own space within that life. I wasn't involved in the details of his business, and I never needed to be. That wasn't how we operated. He handled what he handled. I handled what I handled. It worked because we trusted each other. At least, I thought we did. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is to confuse stability with truth, because nothing about our life felt unstable. If anything, it felt too smooth, too controlled, too complete. There were no arguments worth remembering, no moments that stood out as turning points, no single conversation where everything changed. Instead, everything blended together into a kind of quiet consistency that made it impossible to notice when something shifted. And maybe that's why I didn't question anything. Not when he came home late. Not when his phone stayed just a little too close to him. Not when certain conversations ended just before I walked into the room. None of it felt important enough on its own. Each moment was small, explainable, easy to dismiss. And I did dismiss them, over and over again. Because when you believe in something, really believe in it, you don't look for reasons to doubt it. You look for reasons to protect it. So I protected what I thought we had. I protected the version of our life that made sense. I told myself that everything was normal, that nothing had changed, that I was imagining things that weren't there. And for a while, that was enough to keep everything in place. Until it wasn't. Because once something catches your attention, even for a second, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It waits. And eventually, it comes back. The next time I saw the name, I didn't ignore it. I told myself I was only checking. Just to be sure. Just to confirm that it really was nothing. That the feeling I had before was meaningless. But this time, it didn't feel meaningless. It felt familiar. And that was the first time I allowed myself to pause. Not react. Not assume. Just pause. Because something about it didn't fit. Not in a way I could explain. Not in a way I could prove. But in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. And that was when everything started to change. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone else could see. But in a way that quietly shifted how I looked at everything. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even let it show. Because at that point, I still didn't know what I was looking at. All I knew was that something small, something almost invisible, didn't belong. And for the first time, I stopped assuming it would fix itself. I started paying attention. Just a little more than before. Just enough to notice what I had missed. And just enough to realize this wasn't going to stay small for long. The next time I saw it, I didn't look away. It wasn't intentional at first. I told myself I was just being thorough. Just double-checking something I had already dismissed. But the moment the name appeared again, Blue Harbor Solutions, I felt that same quiet hesitation I hadn't been able to explain before. Only this time. It didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a pattern. The amount was slightly different. Still not large enough to stand out. Not significant enough to raise immediate concern. But the timing didn't make sense. It didn't follow any schedule I could recognize. It didn't align with anything routine. And yet, there it was again. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. Long enough to realize I wasn't just checking anymore. I was looking. I told myself there was a simple explanation. There had to be. Businesses worked in ways I didn't fully understand. Payments moved for reasons I didn't need to question. That had always been the boundary between his world and mine. But something about this didn't feel like part of that world. It felt separate, disconnected. And that was what unsettled me. I didn't do anything drastic. I didn't dig deeper than I had to. I didn't start searching for answers I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I did something much smaller. I remembered it. I closed the screen. But I didn't let it go this time. The name stayed with me. The timing stayed with me. And without realizing it, I started noticing more than I ever had before. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. A late night that lasted a little longer than usual. A call that ended just before I walked into the room. A conversation that felt slightly too controlled, as if every word had already been decided before it was spoken. None of it was enough on its own. But together, it began to feel like something I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront him. I didn't even ask a single question. Because I didn't want to be wrong. There's a moment, before everything changes, where you still have a choice. You can stay where you are, hold on to what feels safe, and convince yourself that everything makes sense. Or you can step forward, just a little, and risk seeing something you can't unsee. I wasn't ready to step forward. So I stayed still. But staying still didn't stop me from watching. The third time I saw the name, I didn't hesitate. I opened the details. Not everything, just enough. The timestamp. The routing. The reference attached to it. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. But I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't random. The spacing between the transactions wasn't consistent. But it wasn't accidental either. There was intention in it. A kind of quiet precision that mirrored something I already recognized. Him. That was when the thought crossed my mind for the first time. Not fully formed. Not something I was ready to accept. Just a possibility. And even that felt like too much. I leaned back from the screen and tried to let it go again. But I couldn't, because once you start noticing patterns, you don't stop seeing them. They begin to show up everywhere. In the way time is used. In the way silence is held. In the way something is just slightly out of place. And suddenly, what once felt invisible becomes impossible to ignore. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. And even if there had been, I wouldn't have known what to say. What was I supposed to explain? That a name I didn't recognize had appeared more than once. That something felt wrong without any proof to support it. Feelings don't hold up under questions. Facts do. And I didn't have facts yet. So I kept everything to myself. But something inside me had already shifted. I started paying attention to things I had never questioned before. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way anyone would notice. Just quietly. The way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. The way certain topics never came up anymore. The way everything still felt normal, but only on the surface. And beneath that surface, something else was moving. Something I couldn't define yet. But something I knew was there. I didn't change how I acted. I didn't give him any reason to think I had noticed anything. Because at that point, I still didn't know what I was seeing. And more importantly, I didn't know what it meant. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going away. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't something that would resolve itself if I ignored it long enough. It was something that had been there before I noticed it. And something that would still be there long after. The next time I sat down in front of that screen, I didn't tell myself it was nothing. I didn't pretend I wasn't looking for something. I didn't try to convince myself that I was just being thorough. Because I understood it now. Not completely. But enough. I wasn't checking anymore. I was paying attention. And whatever this was, it was only just beginning. I didn't go looking for answers all at once. At first, I told myself I was just organizing things. Just making sense of what I had already seen. There was no urgency. No panic. No need to rush into conclusions I wasn't ready to face. But that wasn't entirely true. Because the moment I opened those records again, I wasn't just reviewing anymore. I was searching. I started small. The same name. Blue Harbor Solutions. I followed it through each entry I could find, tracing the dates, the amounts, the intervals between them. At a glance, nothing stood out. The numbers were scattered, irregular, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention now, and the more I looked, the more something began to take shape. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to feel like a pattern forming just beneath the surface. I didn't fully understand it yet, but I could see it. The transactions weren't consistent in size, but they followed a rhythm. Not a predictable schedule, but a controlled one. The gaps between them weren't random. They were spaced just far enough apart to avoid attention, but close enough to maintain continuity. That wasn't coincidence. That was intention. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning through more entries. Going further back than I had before, days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly, piece by piece, the pattern expanded. It wasn't just happening recently. It had been happening for a long time. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It settled in gradually, like something I had always known but never acknowledged. This wasn't new. It was just new to me. I opened a blank document without thinking too much about it. At first, it was just notes, dates, amounts, references. Nothing structured, nothing complete. But as I kept going, those notes turned into something more. A list, then a record, then something that started to feel like evidence. I didn't call it that yet. I wasn't ready to, but I treated it like it mattered. Because it did. The more I wrote down, the more I began to see connections I hadn't noticed before. Certain dates aligned with times he had been busy. Certain gaps matched days that had felt slightly off, though I hadn't questioned them at the time. Everything was still subtle, still explainable. But together, it was becoming harder to ignore. I paused for a moment and scrolled back through everything I had written. It didn't look like much. Just numbers. Just notes. Just fragments of something incomplete. And yet, for the first time, it felt real. Not a feeling. Not a suspicion. Something I could point to. Something I could follow. That was when the thought came back. Stronger this time. Clearer. This wasn't a mistake. I sat back, letting that settle in. Because once you accept that something isn't accidental, you have to face what it might actually be. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Instead, I went deeper. I started looking for something simple, something that should have been there if this was normal. Invoices, receipts, anything that connected these payments to an actual service. An actual exchange. An actual reason. But there was nothing. No matching records. No documentation. No explanation. Just the transactions. Standing on their own. That was the first moment I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter. Clarity. Because absence can say more than presence. And what wasn't there told me more than what was. I stared at the screen for a long time. Longer than I had before. Long enough to stop questioning whether I was imagining things. Long enough to stop looking for excuses. And long enough to understand one thing clearly. This didn't belong. I didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know where it led. But I knew it wasn't part of anything legitimate. And that was enough. I closed the document slowly. Not because I was done, but because I needed a moment to think. Because everything up to that point had been about noticing, about observing, about collecting pieces without fully understanding them. But now, it was different. Now I had something that didn't fit. Something that shouldn't exist without a reason. And that meant there was a reason. I just hadn't found it yet. I stood up and walked away from the screen, trying to create distance between myself and what I had just seen. But it didn't work. Because once something becomes clear, you can't make it unclear again. It stays with you. In the back of your mind, in the way you look at things, in the questions you haven't asked yet. That night, I didn't sleep the way I usually did. Not because I was restless, but because my mind wouldn't let go of what I had found. It kept going back to the same point, the same realization, the same quiet certainty. This wasn't random. This wasn't small. And this wasn't something that would disappear if I ignored it. It was something that had been carefully placed, carefully hidden, and carefully maintained. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't before. Whatever this was, it had been designed not to be seen, which meant someone had made sure of that. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. And I had just found the first piece of something much bigger than I had ever expected. I didn't panic when I realized something was missing. If anything, the absence made everything feel sharper, clearer, easier to understand in a way I hadn't expected. Because by that point, I wasn't looking for proof that everything was normal anymore. I was looking for what didn't belong. And what didn't belong was obvious. There were no invoices, no documentation, no trace of any service tied to the payments I had been tracking. I went back through everything again. Slower this time. More deliberate. I checked each entry against every record I could access. I cross-referenced dates, amounts, vendors, anything that could connect those transactions to something real. But every time I followed the trail, it ended in the same place. Nowhere. That should have made things confusing. But it didn't. It made things simple. Because when something moves through a system without leaving a trace, it's not an oversight. It's intentional. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, letting that settle in, not reacting, not jumping to conclusions, just allowing the truth to take shape without forcing it into something I wanted to believe. This wasn't a vendor. That was the first thing I accepted. Whatever Blue Harbor Solutions was, it didn't exist in the way it was supposed to. It didn't provide anything. It didn't deliver anything. It didn't show up anywhere except where money left. And that changed everything. Because up until that moment, I had still been giving the situation the benefit of doubt. Still leaving room for something I hadn't considered. Something I didn't understand. But now, there wasn't much left to misunderstand. I didn't close the screen right away. Instead, I opened a new tab and searched for the name. Blue Harbor Solutions. The results were minimal. A few vague listings. A generic business name that could belong to anything or nothing at all. No clear presence. No real footprint. Nothing that confirmed it was active in any meaningful way. It felt empty, like something that had been created just enough to exist, but not enough to be known. That alone wouldn't have meant much before. But now, it meant everything. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because something inside me had just settled into place. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. And it definitely wasn't random. It was designed. The thought didn't scare me. It grounded me. Because once you understand that something is intentional, you stop asking if it's real. You start asking why. And more importantly, how. That was the first time I felt the shift. Not just in what I was looking at, but in how I was thinking. I wasn't trying to make sense of my marriage anymore. I was trying to understand a system. And systems follow rules, even when they're hidden. I opened my notes again, this time with a different focus. Not just tracking what I saw, but trying to understand how it worked. The spacing between transactions, the variations in amounts, the absence of documentation. Each detail wasn't random. Each detail was part of something structured. Even if I couldn't see the full structure yet, I started mapping it out. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to see that there was consistency in the inconsistency. That was what stood out the most. Everything was designed to look irregular, but underneath that, there was control. And control always leaves a pattern. You just have to look long enough to see it. I didn't know how far this went. I didn't know how long it had been happening. And I didn't know what it ultimately meant. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't something that had slipped through unnoticed. It had been placed where it couldn't be easily found. And that meant whoever put it there had expected it to stay hidden. For a moment, I considered what would happen if I confronted him. If I asked directly. If I put everything in front of him and demanded an explanation. The answer came quickly. I would lose everything I had just gained. Because the moment he knew I was aware, the system would change. Records could disappear. Patterns could shift. Whatever this was could be erased faster than I could understand it. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. So I did the only thing that made sense. I stayed quiet. Not because I was unsure, but because I was becoming certain. And certainty doesn't need to rush. It builds slowly, carefully, until there's no room left for doubt. I closed the screen and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Nothing had changed on the outside. The room looked the same. The day felt the same. Everything about my life, from the outside, remained exactly as it had been. But inside, something had shifted completely. I wasn't looking at small inconsistencies anymore. I was looking at something deliberate, something hidden, something that had been operating in plain sight without ever being noticed. Until now. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about money leaving. It was about where it was going. And more importantly, who was sending it. I didn't need to say his name. I didn't need to prove it yet. Because deep down, I already understood. This system didn't exist without him. And if it didn't exist without him, then this wasn't something happening around me. It was something happening because of him. I stood up slowly, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. Not relief. Not resolution. Something else. Something quieter. More controlled. Because for the first time, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't wondering if something was wrong. I wasn't trying to convince myself that everything made sense. I knew it didn't. And that knowledge didn't overwhelm me. It focused me because whatever this was, I had only just started to see it. And I wasn't going to stop now. I told myself it was nothing. Even after everything I had already seen. Everything I had already confirmed. There was still a part of me that wanted to believe I was overthinking it. That I had taken a few disconnected details and turned them into something larger than they really were. So I went back. Not because I needed to, but because I couldn't stop. The next night, I opened the records again. The same way I had before. Calm. Careful. Deliberate. But this time, there was no hesitation. No pretending I wasn't looking for something. I was, and it didn't take long to find it. Another transaction. Same name. Blue Harbor Solutions. The amount was slightly higher than before. Not dramatically. Not enough to stand out on its own. But enough to feel like a progression. And the timing, again, didn't match anything routine. It appeared when it wanted to, not when it should have. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. That was what unsettled me the most. I had expected it, and expectation changes everything. One instance can be dismissed. Two can be questioned. But once something begins to repeat, it stops being accidental. It becomes a decision. I didn't move right away. I didn't open new tabs or start searching for explanations. Instead, I just watched. I let the pattern sit in front of me, exactly as it was, without trying to force meaning onto it too quickly. Because by now, I understood something important. If I rushed, I would miss things, and I couldn't afford to miss anything anymore. I opened my notes and added the new entry, carefully placing it alongside the others. Date. Amount. Reference. Nothing more. Nothing less. At first glance, it still looked like a scattered list. But when I stepped back and looked at everything together, it was different. The gaps weren't random. The amounts weren't arbitrary. And the frequency was increasing. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to suggest something was evolving. That was when I stopped looking at each transaction individually and started looking at them as a whole. I scrolled through the records again, this time focusing on movement rather than details. Not what each payment was, but how they connected, and slowly, something began to form. A rhythm, not consistent, not predictable but controlled. The spacing between transactions wasn't equal, but it followed a logic I couldn't fully define yet. It avoided patterns that would be obvious, but it wasn't chaotic either. It was structured, carefully enough to blend in, carefully enough to be overlooked, but not carefully enough to disappear completely. I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle in. This wasn't money slipping through unnoticed. It was being moved. That distinction mattered more than anything else, because accidental loss doesn't repeat itself like this. But intentional movement does. I looked closer at the records again, this time searching for something I hadn't considered before. Connections outside the numbers. People, processes, anything that could explain where this fit within the larger system. But there was nothing. No internal references, no employee recognition, no indication that anyone else within the company was aware of it. That was what made it stand out even more. It existed inside the system, but it wasn't part of it. That didn't make sense, unless it was designed that way. I closed the screen for a moment and sat there in silence, trying to process what I had just confirmed. Because at this point, there was no more doubt left to hold on to. This wasn't something I was imagining. This wasn't something that could be explained away. And this wasn't something that would stop on its own. It was active, ongoing, and growing. I opened my notes again and did something I hadn't done before. I added everything up. Not precisely. Not down to the last cent. Just enough to understand the scale. At first, the numbers didn't seem significant. Then they started to accumulate. And as they accumulated, something inside me went completely still. Because the total didn't stay small. It didn't stay moderate. It didn't even stay manageable. It crossed a line, quietly, without warning, into something much larger than I had expected. 7 figures. I didn't react right away. I didn't feel shock or anger or panic. I just stopped. Because numbers like that don't happen by accident. They don't go unnoticed. And they definitely don't move without intention. I stared at the screen, letting that number sit there, unchanging, undeniable. And for the first time, I understood the scale of what I was looking at. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a side detail. And this wasn't something that could be ignored. It was a system, one that had been running long before I ever noticed it, one that had been designed to remain hidden, and one that had now become impossible to overlook. I closed my laptop slowly, not because I was done, but because I needed to step away for a moment, not to escape it, but to understand what came next. Because finding the pattern wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And if I wanted to prove what I was starting to see, I needed to do more than follow the numbers. I needed to understand them. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. It followed me into everything, not in a loud or overwhelming way, but in a quiet, persistent way that stayed just beneath the surface of every normal moment. I could still go through my day, still speak the same way, still move through the same routines, but something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just living my life anymore. I was observing it. I didn't make any sudden changes. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I let everything appear exactly the same from the outside. I went to work. I came home. I spoke to him the same way I always had. I listened, nodded, responded. Nothing about my behavior gave away what I had already begun to understand. But at night, everything was different. That was when the real work began. I stopped thinking of it as curiosity. It wasn't that anymore. It was responsibility. Because once you see something clearly, you don't get to pretend you didn't. So I started learning, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, just piece by piece, the way everything else had unfolded. I looked up things I had never needed to understand before. Transaction tracing, shell companies, how money moves when it isn't meant to be seen. At first, it was frustrating. The terminology didn't make sense. The structures felt abstract, disconnected from anything I could apply. It felt like trying to read a language I had never spoken. But I didn't stop, because the more I looked at it, the more I started to recognize something familiar. Control. The same kind of control I had already seen in the patterns. And once I recognized that, everything became easier to follow. I didn't need to understand everything. I just needed to understand enough. Enough to see how the pieces fit together. Enough to recognize what I was looking at. And slowly, I did. What once looked like scattered transactions began to feel intentional. Structured. Layered in a way that made them difficult to trace at a glance. But not impossible to follow if you knew where to look. And I was learning where to look. I started applying what I had learned to the records I already had. Not guessing anymore. Analyzing. Looking for timing gaps. Looking for repetition in disguise. Looking for anything that suggested this wasn't just movement, it was design. And every time I checked, the same conclusion came back. This wasn't accidental. It was a system. I didn't say it out loud. I didn't even write it down. But I understood it. Completely. That realization didn't shock me. It didn't even make me angry. It just made everything clearer. Because once you understand that something is built intentionally, you stop looking for mistakes. You start looking for structure. And structure always reveals itself eventually. I became more careful after that. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the risk. If he realized I was paying attention, everything could disappear. Records could change. Patterns could break. Whatever I had started to uncover could be erased before I fully understood it. So I adjusted. I stopped using shared devices. I kept my notes offline. I made sure nothing I did could be traced back to what I was doing. It wasn't paranoia. It was control. And control meant staying invisible. That became my advantage. Because the more I understood, the more I realized something else. He didn't think I knew anything. That assumption protected me. It gave me time. It gave me space. And most importantly, it gave me access. I started expanding what I was looking at. Not just Blue Harbor anymore. If this was a system, then it couldn't exist in isolation. There had to be more. More connections. More entities. More layers that I hadn't seen yet. I didn't find everything. Not yet. But I found enough. Enough to know this was bigger than one name. Bigger than one pattern. And definitely bigger than one explanation. That was when something else changed. Not in the information I had, but in how I saw him. I stopped thinking about him as my husband. Not emotionally. Not mentally. I stopped trying to understand his behavior. His choices. His intentions. Because none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was what he had built. And how it worked. I wasn't trying to understand why. I was trying to understand how, And that difference changed everything. Because once you remove emotion from something like this, it becomes easier to see it clearly. Cleaner, more precise. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel betrayed. I just saw him differently, as part of the system, not separate from it. And that clarity made everything easier to follow. I started organizing everything more carefully. Not just notes anymore. Structure. Dates aligned with patterns. Amounts grouped by movement. Connections mapped out as far as I could see them. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to build something solid. Something that could hold together. Something that could eventually prove what I already knew. And as I looked at everything I had put together, one realization stood out more than anything else. He thought I wasn't paying attention. That was his mistake. Because the more he underestimated me, the safer I became. I closed everything down for the night, sitting in the quiet with a kind of calm I hadn't expected. Not relief, not resolution. Something else. Something sharper. Because for the first time, I understood my position completely. I wasn't behind anymore. I wasn't catching up. I was learning. And learning meant I was getting closer. Closer to understanding everything. Closer to seeing the full picture. And closer to something I hadn't even defined yet. But I could feel it forming. Because as I reviewed one of the entries again, something small caught my attention. Not the amount. Not the timing. The reference. A name. One I had seen before. Just not like this. And for the first time in a long time. Something actually surprised me. It wasn't the amount that caught my attention. It was the name. I almost missed it the first time. It sat there like everything else. Just another reference buried in a line of data that wasn't meant to stand out. But something about it made me stop. Just long enough to notice what I would have ignored before. Alexis. I didn't react immediately. I just looked at it. Let it sit there in front of me without trying to assign meaning to it too quickly. Because by now, I understood how easy it was to jump to conclusions before you had enough to hold on to. But this felt different. Not because the name meant something right away, but because it felt familiar. I leaned back slightly, letting that feeling settle in without forcing it into clarity. I had seen that name before. I was sure of it. Not in a way I could immediately place. Not in a way that connected cleanly to anything I could point to. Just enough to know it wasn't new. And that was enough to matter. I went back through the records. Slower this time. Searching for it again. It didn't appear everywhere. It wasn't attached to every transaction. But it showed up more than once. Quietly. Consistently. Always in the same kind of context. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't random. If the name appeared once, it could be dismissed. Twice. It could be questioned, but repeated in the same pattern. Alongside the same kind of movement. It became part of the system. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't even write the thought down yet. But I felt it. This wasn't just about money anymore. Something else was connected to it. Something I hadn't been looking for. I sat there for a moment, letting my mind move through possibilities without forcing any of them to become real too quickly. Because once you name something, you can't take it back. And I wasn't ready to name it yet. Instead, I did what I had learned to do. I verified. I searched through older records, looking for earlier appearances of the name. Not just recent ones. Not just the ones I had already noticed. I wanted to see if this had been there from the beginning, or if it had appeared later. The answer came slowly, but it came clearly. It hadn't always been there. At some point, it started, and after that, it continued. That was what made it different from everything else. Because patterns that begin have reasons, and patterns that continue have purpose. I opened another tab and searched the name. Nothing obvious came up at first. Too many results. Too many possibilities. Too many directions that led nowhere. So I narrowed it, added context, filtered what I could, and eventually something appeared. Not enough to confirm anything, but enough to connect. A name, a face, a presence that felt just slightly too close to something I already knew. I didn't react. I didn't let myself, because reaction would come later. Right now, I needed clarity. I went back to the records again, overlaying what I had just found with what I already knew. Dates, transactions, appearances. And slowly, the alignment became impossible to ignore. The timing matched too well. Too precisely. Not perfectly, but close enough that coincidence stopped being a reasonable explanation. I sat there in silence, staring at everything laid out in front of me. Because at that point, there were only two possibilities left. Either I was forcing connections that weren't real, or I was finally seeing what had been there all along. I didn't need to decide which one it was right away, because the data didn't require belief. It just existed. And what existed was enough. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, not to escape it, but to let it settle into place. Because something had just shifted. Not in the information, but in what it meant. This wasn't just hidden money. This wasn't just a system built to move things quietly from one place to another. It was connected to a person, a real one. And that changed everything. I opened my eyes again and looked back at the screen. At the name. At the pattern. At the connections that had started to form whether I was ready for them or not. I thought about confronting him. Just for a second. Imagined what it would look like. What he would say. How quickly everything could unravel into something loud. Something messy. Something impossible to control. And just as quickly as the thought came, it disappeared. Because I already knew the answer. I didn't have enough. Not yet. And more importantly, I had something far more valuable than confrontation. I had time. And I had silence. I wasn't going to give that up. Not now. Not when everything was just starting to become clear. I closed the screen slowly. Not out of uncertainty, but out of control. Because I didn't need to look at it anymore to understand what I had found. The name wasn't just a detail. It was a connection. And connections lead somewhere. I just hadn't followed it far enough yet. But I would. Because now, I wasn't just following money. I was following something real. Something that existed beyond numbers. Something that had a presence. And something that, whether I was ready for it or not, was about to change everything. Numbers told me something was wrong, but they couldn't show me everything. At some point, I understood that clearly. I could keep tracing transactions, mapping patterns, and building structure, but there was a limit to what numbers alone could reveal. They could suggest, they could point, they could even confirm, but they couldn't show me reality, and I needed to see it. That realization didn't come with urgency. It came with precision. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't act impulsively. Instead, I waited. I watched his routines the same way I had watched everything else, quietly, without interference, without drawing attention to what I was doing. And slowly, I started to notice something. His schedule wasn't as consistent as I had once believed. There were gaps, not obvious ones, not dramatic shifts that anyone else would question. But small inconsistencies that only stood out if you were already looking for them. Late meetings that didn't quite align with his usual patterns. Changes in timing that felt just slightly out of place. Days that stretched longer than they should have. None of it proved anything, but it was enough. I chose one day. Not randomly. Carefully. A day that followed one of those subtle inconsistencies. A day where something didn't quite fit into the structure I had come to understand. I didn't tell myself what I expected to find. I didn't assume anything. I just followed. At a distance, far enough not to be seen. Close enough not to lose him. There was a moment, just before I started, where I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Not hesitation. Just awareness. Because once you step into something like that, there's no going back to not knowing, and I was ready for that. He drove in silence, the same way he always did. Focused. Controlled. Nothing about his movements suggested anything unusual. If anything, it made everything feel more normal. Too normal. Because normal doesn't hide anything. But this did. He didn't go to the office. That was the first break. he didn't go anywhere I recognized. Instead, he turned into a part of the city that didn't belong to any of his usual routines. Quiet. Discreet. The kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I stayed back. Watched from a distance. Didn't move too close. Because this wasn't about confrontation. This was about confirmation. He parked. Stepped out. And then, he waited. That was the part that slowed everything down. Time stretched. Minutes passed without anything happening. And in that stillness, something inside me became completely calm. Because whatever was about to happen, it was already decided. I had just arrived at the moment it revealed itself. Then she appeared. At first, I didn't see her clearly. Just a figure approaching. Nothing distinct. Nothing that immediately connected. But as she moved closer, something shifted. Not in the scene. In me, because recognition doesn't always come instantly. Sometimes it builds piece by piece, detail by detail, until it becomes undeniable. And when it did, I didn't react. I didn't move. I didn't even feel what I thought I would feel. It was Alexis, standing there, not as a name in a record, not as a possibility, but as something real, something present, something undeniable. I didn't need to hear anything. I didn't need to see more than I already had. Because everything I had been tracing, every pattern, every connection, every piece that didn't make sense before, it all aligned in that moment. Perfectly. They spoke. Not in a way I could hear, but in a way I could see. Comfortable. Familiar. Unhidden. That was what stood out the most. There was no hesitation between them. No distance. No uncertainty. This wasn't new. It wasn't something that had just begun. It was something that had been there long before I noticed it. And for some reason, that didn't hurt. Not the way I thought it would. I expected anger. I expected something sharp. Something immediate. Something that would push me forward into action. But there was nothing like that. Just clarity. Cold. Precise. Complete. I watched for a few more moments. Not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to understand the dynamic, and what I saw confirmed everything. This wasn't hidden in the way I had imagined. It wasn't careful. It wasn't fragile. It was established, integrated into something that had been running alongside my life without ever intersecting with it. Until now, I could have stepped out. I could have walked toward them, said something, ended it right there. But I didn't, because that wasn't the move. Not anymore. That would have been reaction. And I wasn't reacting. I was controlling, so I stayed where I was, invisible, unseen. And I let the moment pass without interfering. Because what I had just seen wasn't something I needed to act on immediately. It was something I needed to use. I turned away before they did. Left before there was any chance of being noticed. And as I walked back to my car, something inside me settled into place completely. They thought they were hiding. They thought this existed outside of everything else. But they were wrong. Because now, it existed in front of me. Clearly, fully. Without anything left to guess. I sat in silence for a moment before starting the engine. Not thinking about what I had just seen, but about what came next. Because this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And for the first time, I understood something with absolute certainty. Knowing the truth wasn't enough, but it was everything I needed to move forward. The truth didn't break me, it reorganized everything. By the time I got home, the version of my life I had been living no longer existed in the same way. It hadn't collapsed. It hadn't shattered. It had simply shifted. Quietly. Completely. And that shift changed how I saw everything. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even look at him differently. Because there was no advantage in revealing what I knew. Not yet. Instead, I did what I had always done. I observed. But now, I wasn't looking for answers. I already had them. Now, I was studying behavior. He walked in like nothing had changed. Same tone. Same routine. Same casual way of existing in a space that, just hours ago, I would have called ours, but it wasn't ours anymore. Not in the way I used to believe. And somehow, that made it easier to stay calm. We had dinner. We talked about small things. Normal things. The kind of conversations that fill space without meaning anything. And I realized something in the middle of it. He wasn't pretending. Not consciously. Because to him, this version of reality was already normalized. There was no guilt in his voice. No hesitation in his actions. No sign that he believed he was doing anything wrong. That was the most revealing part. Because deception isn't always about hiding. Sometimes, it's about compartmentalizing so completely that nothing overlaps. And he had perfected that. Later that night, I sat alone, not thinking about what he had done, but about what it meant. Not emotionally, strategically. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about structure, patterns, systems. Everything I had already started mapping out before I even knew the full truth. And now, those patterns had context. I went back through everything. Every transaction. Every timeline. Every moment that had felt slightly off before. But this time, I wasn't looking for anomalies. I was looking for connections. And they were everywhere. Subtle. Hidden beneath layers of normal behavior. But once you see the framework, you can't unsee it. There were overlaps between his work hours and locations I now recognized. Payments that didn't match any logical business expense. Small, consistent transfers that, individually, meant nothing but collectively told a story. A very clear one. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was maintained. Sustained over time. Which meant one thing. It was planned. And if it was planned, then it could be dismantled. That realization didn't feel like revenge. It felt like control. I didn't need to act emotionally. I didn't need to react to what I had seen. Because everything I needed was already in front of me. Data. Behavior. Proof. But more importantly, leverage. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because my mind was already moving ahead. Steps. Sequences. Outcomes. I didn't rush into anything. I built. Carefully. The same way I had built everything else in my life. Except this time, I was building something different. Not stability. Not partnership. But separation. He left for work without noticing anything. Without questioning anything. Without realizing that the balance had already shifted. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because the moment he realized, it would already be too late. I started organizing everything. Documents. Access points. Accounts. Anything that connected us. Not in a way that would raise suspicion, but in a way that would give me control when the time came. Because timing was everything. Act too early, and you lose advantage. Act too late, and you lose opportunity. I needed the exact moment where everything aligned, where the truth, the structure, and the outcome would all converge. And I wasn't there yet, but I was close. Days passed. Nothing changed on the surface. Everything changed underneath. He continued his routines. His patterns remained consistent, which made my work easier. Because consistency creates predictability, and predictability creates vulnerability. I didn't follow him again. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough. Now, I was building something stronger than observation. Preparation. And with every step I took, one thing became clearer and clearer. This wasn't just about exposing him. It wasn't just about ending something that had already been broken. It was about redefining the outcome. On my terms. Completely. There was a moment, late one night, where I paused, not because I doubted anything, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to do. Once I moved forward, there would be no going back, no resetting, no pretending none of this had happened. But then again, there was nothing left to go back to. So I didn't hesitate. I finalized the next step. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but with the same clarity that had guided me from the moment I saw them together. Because now, everything made sense. And when things make sense, they become simple. And when something becomes simple, it becomes inevitable. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and let the silence settle around me. Not as something empty, but as something complete. Because the truth had done its job. And now, it was time for me to do mine. Everything was ready except the moment. That was the only thing I refused to rush. Because preparation means nothing without precision. And precision depends on timing. I had built the structure, secured the details, and mapped out every possible outcome. Now, all that remained was choosing when to let it unfold. And that choice mattered more than anything else. I watched him the same way I always had. Calm, observant, unnoticed. He didn't change. If anything, he became more predictable, more comfortable, more certain that whatever he had built outside of our life was safe, contained, and invisible. That confidence was his greatest weakness, because it meant he had stopped looking for risks, and I had become one. There was a specific pattern I had been waiting for, a convergence, his schedule, her availability, and the financial movement that connected them both. Individually, they meant nothing, but together, they created a moment, and when that moment appeared, I recognized it instantly. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was just another day on the surface. But underneath, everything aligned perfectly. He left earlier than usual. Not by much. Just enough to signal that something was different. Something planned. I didn't follow him immediately. I waited. Because I didn't need to see where he was going. I already knew. Instead, I focused on something else. Access. Control. Final positioning. By the time I left the house, I wasn't chasing anything. I was stepping into a sequence I had already set in motion. The location wasn't new. I had been there before. Not physically, but through patterns, through data, through everything I had already uncovered. And when I arrived, everything confirmed what I expected. His car was there. So was hers. Parked with the kind of casual proximity that only exists when two people believe they aren't being watched. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. Because today wasn't about witnessing, it was about execution. I stayed in my car for a moment. Not thinking, not hesitating, just aligning everything one last time. And then, I made the first move. Not toward them. Toward the structure around them. Because the truth is, exposure doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from removing the illusion of control. And I was about to do exactly that. The sequence unfolded quietly. No sudden movements. No dramatic interruptions. Just a series of actions that, individually, meant nothing. But together, changed everything. Access points closed. Permissions shifted. Connections severed. And most importantly, visibility redirected. They didn't notice. Not at first. Because from their perspective, nothing had changed. They were still inside their version of reality. Still operating within something they believed was stable. But stability is fragile when it's built on something hidden. And I had just removed the foundation. I stepped out of the car, not to approach them, but to position myself where I needed to be, not physically close, but strategically present. Because when the moment came, I wanted to see it, not for emotion, but for confirmation. Minutes passed, and then it started, subtle at first, a shift in behavior. A pause that didn't belong. A glance that lingered just a second too long. Confusion always begins quietly. Because the mind tries to make sense of what doesn't fit before it accepts that something is wrong. He checked his phone. Once, then again, then a third time. That was the first break. Not in the situation. In him? Because something, somewhere, had stopped working the way it was supposed to. And he could feel it. Even if he didn't understand it yet. She noticed too. Not the cause, but the effect, the shift in his attention. The way his focus pulled away from her and locked onto something invisible. That's when the dynamic changed. Not between them. Inside them. Because certainty had just been replaced with doubt. And doubt spreads fast. I watched it happen in real time. Not with satisfaction. Not with anger. But with clarity. Because this wasn't chaos. This was design. Every step had led to this. Every detail had been placed intentionally. And now, it was unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. He stood up. Abruptly. Not because he wanted to leave. But because something inside him told him he needed to. Urgency doesn't come from understanding. It comes from instinct. And his instinct was finally catching up to reality. She said something. I couldn't hear it. But I didn't need to, because her expression said everything. Confusion. Uncertainty. The beginning of realization. Not about me. Not yet. But about the instability of what they thought they had. He stepped away. Pulled his phone out again. Tried to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Because it was already done. I stayed where I was. Still. Silent. Watching the exact moment his control slipped out of his hands. And for the first time since this began, I saw it. Not clearly. Not completely. But enough. The shift. The fracture. The point where everything he thought he had secured started to unravel. Not violently. Not dramatically. But inevitably, and that was the difference. Because this wasn't destruction. This was dismantling. Careful. Precise. Irreversible. I didn't need to stay any longer. I had seen what I needed to see. So I turned, walked back to my car, and left before the full weight of it settled on them. Because by the time they understood what had happened, I would already be somewhere else. Not physically, but strategically. Ahead. Always ahead. As I drove away, one thought settled into place with absolute certainty. This was no longer about uncovering the truth. That part was over. This was about control. And I had just taken it back completely. He realized something was wrong before he understood why. I could see it in the way he moved when he came home that night. Not slower. Not louder. Just off. Like someone walking through a space that no longer responds the way it used to. He didn't greet me the same way. Didn't settle into his routine with the same ease. There was a pause, small. Almost invisible, but it was there. And pauses like that don't come from nothing. They come from disruption. I stayed exactly where I always sat. Calm. Unchanged. Because from my side, nothing had shifted. At least, not in a way he could detect. Everything okay? I asked. Simple. Neutral. The kind of question that doesn't invite suspicion. He hesitated. Just for a second. Yeah, he said. But it came out slightly delayed. Just work stuff. Work. The easiest explanation. The safest one. And under normal circumstances, I would have accepted it without a second thought. But this wasn't normal anymore. And neither was he. I watched him move through the house, checking his phone more than usual, not responding to anything I could see. Just looking, waiting, trying to find something that wasn't there anymore. Because I had already removed it. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to destabilize. Enough to make him question the reliability of the systems he depended on. And once doubt enters, control starts to slip. We had dinner in near silence. Not uncomfortable. Not tense. Just quiet. Because his attention wasn't here. It was somewhere else. Somewhere he couldn't reach anymore. I didn't push. Didn't probe. Because pressure would have given him direction. And right now, he had none. After dinner, he stepped outside. Phone in hand. Pacing. That was new. He wasn't a pacer. He was controlled. Measured. Predictable. But now, he was searching. And searching means you've already lost something. I stayed inside. Watched through the window. Not hiding. Not revealing. Just existing in a space that no longer included him the way it used to. He made a call. Then another. Then another. each one shorter than the last, because whatever he was trying to reach, it wasn't responding. Or worse, it was gone. When he came back in, there was a different kind of energy around him. Not panic, not yet, but tension. The kind that builds quietly before it breaks. He looked at me, for a moment longer than usual, like he was trying to see something that wasn't visible. "Did anything happen today?" he asked. There it was. The first real shift. Not an accusation. Not even suspicion. Just a question. But questions like that don't come from nowhere. They come from disruption. I met his gaze. Steady, unmoved. "No," I said simply. "Why?" He hesitated again, then shook his head. No reason. But there was a reason. He just didn't understand it yet. And that uncertainty was exactly where I needed him to be. Because clarity gives people power. Confusion takes it away. The next few days followed the same pattern. Small changes. Subtle disruptions. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced back to a single cause. But enough to create instability. His routine started to fracture. Not visibly. Not in ways anyone else would notice. But I could see it. The way his timing shifted. The way his attention drifted. The way his confidence started to erode. Because systems don't collapse all at once. They break down in layers. And I had already removed the first few. He tried to compensate. That was expected. Adjust. Recalculate. Find new ways to regain control. But every adjustment led him further away from stability. Because he didn't understand the structure anymore. He didn't see the full picture. Only the parts that were already failing. And reacting to failure without understanding its source only accelerates it. One night, he stayed up late. Later than usual. Laptop open. Phone beside him. Moving between them with increasing urgency. That was the closest he had come to panic. Not because of what he saw, but because of what he couldn't. Missing access. Broken connections. Data that no longer aligned with what he expected. And for someone like him, someone who depended on control, that was enough. I didn't interrupt. Didn't acknowledge. Because this wasn't a conversation. This was a realization. And realizations can't be forced. They have to arrive on their own. Eventually, he closed the laptop, sat back, stared at nothing. And in that moment, I saw it. The shift from confusion to awareness. Not complete. Not fully formed. But present. He knew something had changed. He just didn't know what or who. And that uncertainty was the final piece. Because once someone realizes they've lost control, they start looking for the source. And when he did, when he finally connected everything, I wanted him to understand one thing clearly. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a system failure. It was intentional. Every step, every shift, every fracture in the structure he thought he controlled. I stood up, walked past him, not stopping. Not slowing, just moving through the space like I always had. But this time, there was a difference. Because now, I wasn't part of his system anymore. I was outside of it. And as I reached the doorway, I paused. Not long, just enough. Then I spoke. Calm. Even controlled. "You should probably check everything again," I said. I didn't turn around. Didn't wait for a response. Because I didn't need to see his reaction. I already knew what it would be. Confusion. Then realization. Then something else. Something deeper. Because that was the moment the truth would finally start to take shape for him. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The same way it had for me. And when it did, there would be no doubt left. No illusion. No control. Only understanding. And by then, it would already be too late. The moment he understood, everything stopped pretending. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic confrontation. No sudden explosion of truth spilling into the room. Just a slow, irreversible shift. The kind that begins quietly and ends everything. He sat there longer than usual that night. Not working. Not scrolling. Just still, as if he was replaying everything in his head, trying to find the exact point where things had started to fall apart. But there wasn't a single point. There never is. Because collapse doesn't begin when something breaks. It begins when someone else takes control. And by the time you notice, it's already gone. I didn't interrupt him. Didn't push him toward the realization he was already approaching. Because this wasn't something I needed to explain. It was something he needed to arrive at on his own. Eventually, he looked up, not directly at me, but in my direction, like he was trying to confirm something without fully saying it. "You changed something," he said. Not a question, a statement, but still uncertain, still incomplete. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't have one, but because silence, in moments like this, says more than words ever could. I adjusted what needed to be adjusted. I said finally, calm, neutral, accurate. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, in understanding, because that was the moment it clicked. Not everything, but enough. Why? He asked. And that question? That was the one that mattered. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he needed to hear it. From me. I held his gaze. Steady, unmoved. Because you already made your decision, I said. Simple, direct, final. There was a long pause after that. Not filled with tension, not filled with conflict. Just reality settling into place. He looked away first. That was new. Because he had always been the one in control. The one who dictated how things moved. How conversations flowed. How outcomes unfolded. But not anymore. You could have just said something, he muttered. There it was. The last attempt to reshape the narrative. To turn what had already happened into something that could still be negotiated. But this wasn't a negotiation. Not anymore. I replied quietly. You just weren't listening. That ended it. Not the relationship. Not officially. But the illusion of it. Because once the truth is spoken without resistance, there's nothing left to defend. The next few days were different. Not chaotic. Not dramatic. Just clear. We moved through the same space like two people who understood that something had already ended, even if the final steps hadn't been taken yet. There were no arguments. No accusations. No emotional outbursts. Because everything that needed to be said already had been. He tried, once or twice, to fix things. Small attempts, subtle gestures, but they didn't land. Not because I rejected them, but because they no longer belonged to anything real. And he knew it. I could see it in the way he stopped trying after a while. Not out of acceptance, but out of understanding. Because some things don't break loudly. They dissolve. Quietly. Completely. The final step came without resistance. No drawn-out conversations. No complicated decisions. Just signatures. Documents. Separation. Clean. Precise. Exactly the way everything else had unfolded. When it was done, I didn't feel relief. Or sadness. Or even closure. Just stillness. The kind that comes when something ends the way it was meant to. Without chaos. Without regret. Just clarity. I walked out of that chapter of my life the same way I had moved through all of it. Calm. Controlled. Unapologetic. Because in the end, this was never about revenge. Not really. It was about understanding, seeing things for what they truly were, and deciding not to stay in something that required you to ignore the truth to survive it. And as I stepped forward into something new, one thought stayed with me. Not everything that breaks is a loss. Sometimes, it's the moment everything finally becomes clear. If you've ever had a moment where the truth changed everything for you quietly. Without warning, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, where control, clarity, and consequences unfold step by step, stay here. Because the next story might feel closer to your life than you expect. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.